tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So for the last couple of weeks, we looked very broadly at the history of the physical yoga practices, somatic and breath work and postural and exercise type yoga practices. This, of course, is just a small fraction of what the word yoga points to, but we got to it in the context of this discussion we've been having since the beginning of the calendar year around some of the foundations of our practice, sleep and food and exercise. And when we got to yoga, we took a slight detour into like, what is yoga anyway? So we've done that for a couple of weeks, and we've looked at the way that the practice that many of us maybe most naturally think of as yoga, the practice of bringing the body into shapes and either moving through them with the breath or holding them static for a little while, how this practice begins in the maybe late medieval period, really starts to generate momentum in about the 15th, 16th century. Before that, the word yoga is almost entirely used only to refer to meditation in stillness, mostly concentration practices, but in some traditions, devotional practice, chanting practices, in the tantras, visualization and mantra practices. And the physical practice starts to really assemble in what I might call the early modern period. So 15th, 16th century. By the time the British take over India from the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, there's a strong physical yoga practice, and it continues to be developed through the period of the British Empire in India, and through that time absorbs many different bodies of pun not intended, but welcome, bodies of knowledge and practice from streams of European physical practice that arrive in India, often with missionaries. So we talked a little bit about the YMCA brings certain kinds of exercises. There's different kinds of wrestling, different kinds of circus contortion arise. And the yogis who are practicing broadly in what's known as hatha yoga, or the forceful yoga practice. Hatha means forceful in the sense of forcing vital energy or prana into the central channel, largely is where that word probably originates. There's a secondary commentarial gloss, kind of a metaphorical gloss on the word hatha that spins it as sun moon, and but that's a kind of second level use of the word. It's become more metaphysical and imagistic by that point, but the original use of the word is that it's the forceful yoga. And so through the period of the British Empire, yoga is growing in its physical vocabulary, until by the end of the British Empire in the 20th century, yoga has developed into, particularly in the southern school around Mysore, and the students of Sri Krishnamacharya, there has developed into a very elaborate system of complex postures. And the three primary students of Krishnamacharya are BKS Iyengar, who focuses on extremely precise alignment in static poses, with a lot of props to help the alignment become even more precise and perhaps disciplinary to some. Iyengar studied with Krishnamacharya for a very short time, so developed his practice almost entirely on his own. Likewise, Sri Patabi Joyce, studied with Krishnamacharya only for a very short time, and then developed a vigorous movement-based practice where one holds Ujjayi pranayama and a gentle mula bandha while moving through a continuous flow of postures linked together by a forward-bending sequence known as Surya Namaskar, or the sun salutation. That form eventually would blossom into the many, many variations of flow yoga that started appearing in the 1980s outside of India. Krishnamacharya's third student was Desikachar, who studied with Krishnamacharya for far longer. He was part of Krishnamacharya's family, and ended up teaching a much gentler practice than either Pattabhi Jois or Iyengar, and one that retained some of the elements of the kind of vinyasa that Krishnamacharya originally had brought in, and eventually became more associated in a certain way with like almost a kind of therapeutics, and some aspects of yoga therapy are developed in the Desikachar lineage. At the same time as all that is happening, up in the north, in Rishikesh, Swami Shivananda is developing a physical practice that is built onto a scaffolding of a much more devotional Hindu yogic practice in the Shaiva lineage. Krishnamacharya down south is Vaishnava, so with centered around Vishnu and Krishna. And Krishnamacharya, we said, I'm sort of repeating last week's talk, but to get us caught up for anyone who wasn't there, Krishnamacharya does not approve of the ascetic practices understood as central by the Hatha yogis, particularly the way that they, the ascetic Hatha yoga practice is also where the sexual yogas are being practiced. And Krishnamacharya really disapproves of that angle in Hatha yoga. And so he skips over it entirely in his reference to a classical yoga tradition. And Krishnamacharya brings forward this much more ancient text, the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, that we call Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And this is a meditative text, possibly originally Buddhist, or a blend of Yogacara Buddhist and Sankhya from the 4th century. But Krishnamacharya takes it both as a guide for practice and as a devotional text, and primarily teaches his students to chant it, actually, more than he actually talks about the meditations described in it. He teaches it as a framework for all of yoga. And so this is still taught in teacher trainings and yoga courses now, and because of Krishnamacharya's influence. If not for his influence, I don't think it would be taught. It's, almost no one actually does the practices described in it. And it's quite anachronistic to the kind of yoga that most folks who are venerating the text now are doing. So people are doing a very strong physical practice and not much meditation, but then they're chanting this text that is entirely about meditation and very deep concentration meditation. And it's not really about postures at all. So that's one of the strange mixtures of modern yoga that we inherited from Krishnamacharya. So all of this is what comes to the global north through the process that begins during the British Empire in the 19th century, but then accelerates into the late 20th century when the Western hippies go to India and practice, and Indian teachers, but primarily Western teachers, start to come back from trips to India in the 60s. And they come back to Europe and the United States and begin to teach these practices in very different ways. The students of Pattabhi Jois maintain a connection with his school in Mysore and go back often. Students of Iyengar in the early days maintain a connection with Iyengar's home shala or teaching space. In other traditions, people study and then come, to the West and just begin to teach here, and there starts to grow some distance from the original traditions. In a very different way, the Shivananda folks actually set up ashrams in the United States and Europe. And so if you go to a Shivananda ashram, you're actually getting, almost like the experience of the ashram at Rishikesh kind of transplanted into wherever you're going. That's very different from what you'll find like in a contemporary yoga studio. And so through our lifetimes then, through the late 20th century and into the 21st, physical yoga, like takes fire in the culture, as you know well, spreads in the form of commercial yoga studios where you pay a price for class. They're often quite separate from their original lineages. You get teachers who are teaching now, types of yoga that are several steps away from these original kind of root lineages, although depending on where you are, you'll often encounter either like pure Iyengar studios where you get just Iyengar classes, fairly crisp in that lineage. And then you'll get, like general flow type or vinyasa type studios where people are teaching flow kinds of classes that are often quite further distant from Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga series than the Iyengar classes are from Iyengar, but that retain often the basic form of Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga system, the linking poses with Surya Namaskar, things like that. And of course, many lineages branched off of that. So, the Anusara lineage that was hot for a while and then crashed and burned was an elaboration of kind of an outgrowth of Iyengar and some of the principles of alignment in Iyengar, and a gifted teacher and charismatic teacher named John Friend founded that system, and it was extremely influential for many years. He crashed in some scandal and disappeared. And there have been, so many like offshoots of these main northern and southern traditions, some of which, have really thrived, some of which have collapsed. Just this past week, a really shady yoga guru was arrested in Eastern Europe, who'd been operating for many, many, many years. A lot of us knew of him. I knew folks who practiced in his lineage, and so he was just arrested for like sex trafficking and some pretty gnarly crimes in the process of his kind of running this extended yoga school for many decades. So as yoga, grew and exploded in Europe and the Americas and globally, but I'm primarily speaking to the European and American situation and primarily to the North American situation. It metastasizes in postmodern culture in extraordinary ways. I use the term postmodern. I'm not even going to really try to define it, but one way of thinking about the postmodern is that the modern period, which I might say goes from about the 17th century into the late 20th, but really you can think of it primarily in the 20th century. In the modernist period, you get folks doing things like searching for what's authentic, doing historical research to find like what's the heart of this thing? How do we do it right? How do we compile and assemble and systematize and formalize lineages, bodies of teaching? So the translating of texts and the compiling of manuals, this is a very modernist kind of gesture. The Another modernist gesture are like cross-cultural gestures that aim to resolve differences. So, famous ideas like the perennial philosophy, which is a term that Aldous Huxley used to describe mythic and archetypal spiritual traditions from around the world as a way to say they all have a kind of common core. One of those common cores is like the hero's journey, right? The sort of the masculine, usually, archetype of the hero who leaves home, has adventures, encounters danger, finds themselves, comes back home having gained wisdom, and there's a kind of full circle. It was a modernist and, but now we would say also colonial kind of project to explore and translate from and enter into relationship with indigenous and local, not always indigenous, but indigenous and local national traditions from around the world, and look for their commonalities, and also look for ways that that folks in the colonizer position could participate. So it's a modernist project to translate the body of the Buddhist texts, right? We participate in that project whenever we draw upon the skillful English translations, for instance, of the Pali Canon or of the Tibetan Kongyur. These are modernist projects. The term postmodern is then brought in partly to talk about not just what happens next in linear time, but what happens when the assumptions of the modernist project begin to unravel. So like when the idea of a perennial philosophy crumbles, right? It crumbles once you actually listen to, indigenous folks who say, actually, my myth is not the same as their myth, or when you look and say, oh, actually, the idea that all of these things were similar, they only look similar from a certain position of a resource extractive power, from a British Empire that says, oh yeah, we are in control of, Canada and South Africa and India and Burma and then says, oh, and we're going to pull all of that knowledge in, and all of that wealth into the British Museum, and then we're going to notice how it all has similar, outlines. And so, postmodernism kicks in when you start to say, wait a minute, that's that kind of project has political implications, social implications, implications in violence, implications in the economy, and you start to have movements to like dismantle the collection of the British Museum and send the treasures of the many parts of the world back to the cultures that actually created them and own them. That's a postmodern gesture. And so in yoga, we could understand as a modernist gesture, the folks who, for instance, studied with someone like Pattabhi Jois, loved the Ashtanga system, made manuals describing the Ashtanga system that someone like Pattabhi Jois never made, wrote books about it, made that beautiful poster that was hanging in a lot of yoga studios a bunch of years ago with like, 300 postures, every posture perfectly photographed, all in a row. I remember staring at that poster and being like, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it. I can't do that one, I can do that, I can do that. I'm really bad at that one. Like, I hate that one. Oh my God, okay, this whole sequence I can do. And then it starts to get worse and worse and worse and worse, like that poster is a modernist project. A postmodern, reevaluation of that starts to happen when a bunch of things happen. First of all, folks encounter like the system that Pattabhi Jois put together. Pattabhi Jois himself was a kind of modernizing figure. He took this mysterious and very wide open practice that his teacher Krishnamacharya had initiated, and he formalized it into this very set kind of sequence. And then he taught it to people all around the world in a systematic way and spread that system all over the place. To the point when I began doing Ashtanga in the mid 1990s, it was still close enough to Pattabhi Jois's teaching that the studio where I practiced at, they felt like it was kind of radical that they had altered the primary series. They had said the primary series is super long and it's hard, so we made this kind of abbreviated version that they called Rocket, the Rocket series. And even 10 years later, when I would become a vinyasa teacher, a flow teacher, I never even said I'm altering Pattabhi Jois's series. I just taught whatever the heck I wanted and flowed together, using Surya Namaskar. So I was kind of post Ashtanga, basically. And I was teaching essentially what we would call, a kind of almost a post lineage kind of way. I didn't get direct transmission from Pattabhi Jois. My teachers did. So one of my most beloved teachers, Alice Shuanu, studied with Pattabhi Jois, until he helped her up from a deep backbend once in a way that was, physically inappropriate, and then kissed her. And she was like, I'm out of here. Thank you very much. And it turns out he did that with a whole bunch of people and worse. And part of what happens in the postmodern is that all of these gurus start to be interrogated by the standards of, their students, who now expect them to not be abusive in a number of ways, and they fail by and large. And so there's cascading scandals, both sexual but also financial and lineage, throughout the 80s and 90s and aughts. A postmodern gesture is, the scholarship that came out around the founder of so-called Kundalini yoga, and who eventually is outed essentially as inventing the entire practice, and not really having any authentic or very little authentic yogic lineage, and he just invents a whole bunch of stuff, and then gazillions of Westerners begin to wear white and chant the Sikh mantras and do this practice. And part of the mystery of all of this is that a lot of those folks gain real benefit from doing that practice, right? It's the postmodern, I guess this is a lecture on what postmodernity is, but part of what's mysterious about the postmodern is that it understands that even categories like authentic and inauthentic, are modernist markers. So to say that Kundalini yoga is not authentic, that's a modernist project to find clear lineages and organize them and keep them straight. Yogi Bhajan was both kind of a con man. He made up this whole thing. He said that it was ancient. It wasn't. He made a ton of money off of gullible Western disciples. At the same time, he started an enormous organization that taught contemplative practices to a ton of people, many of whom benefited tremendously. As it turns out, no one owns what yoga is, and everything was invented by somebody at some point. And so a very postmodern response to Yogi Bhajan is, yeah, he was kind of a crook, and he didn't come from any lineage, and he made up a whole bunch of stuff and lied, and defrauded people out of money. At the same time, he made up a really kind of amazing thing. It works, which is to say it has an effect on the body-mind that for many people is really positive. And that's how yoga develops. Somebody invented something at some point and it worked. And this is what's always happened, is practitioners in the heat of their own practice evolve the practice forward. We are not still doing what the sages in the Upanishads were doing, by and large. We're not still doing what, the folks doing fire sacrifice in the Rig Veda were doing, by and large. Even the modern Brahmanic, fire tenders who are doing fire sacrifice and trying to do it the way it's described in the Vedas are still doing a modernist practice, right? The way they get paid, the way they exist in modern Hindu culture is, it's contemporary. And so, the current that brings yoga into the present moment, it runs through these intense influences. The influence of the colonial period is present in everything that we call yoga, including everything that we call the Buddha Dharma. Buddhism exists in the West because of how the British encountered it in Sri Lanka. Buddhism was revived in India in the mid-20th century because of British folks and other European folks who heard about the Buddha through translations of Buddhist texts from Sri Lanka, but also Mahayana texts from China and Japan started to be present, and they went looking for it. And and they couldn't find it because Buddhism had disappeared in India almost 1,000 years before. And all of the great temples had either been converted to Hindu temples or mosques, or buried completely under hills, and the British went and they said, no, there's supposed to be a great Buddhist pilgrimage site here. And they started digging and they found them. They found a temple in Bodh Gaya that was just a Hindu temple, and they found the Hindu guys running it. And they were like, oh yeah, this is a temple, and they said, oh, this is the temple of the Buddha's birthplace. And this was, it was a colonial project to revive Buddhism in India. It wasn't just the British, of course. Buddhism was also revived in India as a result of the Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet. So when the Chinese invade Tibet, huge amounts of Tibetan natives and practitioners flee over the mountains. India takes them in as refugees in a very, very generous way, including allowing them to found entire towns and take over entire regions in India, essentially forming a Tibet and a Tibetan government in diaspora, even allowing them to rebuild entire Tibetan monastic universities in India. So now you can get a complete Tibetan monastic education in India. And all as a result of this genocidal occupation of the Chinese, that continues to this day. And so everything we have in these traditions is interwoven with the conditions that brought it to us. So when we read the Buddha's words in English, we're encountering them through layers of translation. But translation doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Translation happens in political context, right? So not separate from, not separate from, the Sri Lankan Civil War, not separate from how the British conquered Burma, right? The reason that there is a Vipassana in the West and a 10-day retreat in the Goenka tradition or the Mahasi tradition, the two big, traditions of Vipassana outside Burma, this is because when the British arrived in Burma and conquered it very easily, almost without resistance, the Burmese monastic authorities realized that in order for their tradition to survive, it had to be held beyond the monastery. So they started to publish books, and they invented a form where lay people could practice intensive meditation for a short period of time. And so the 10-day retreat was born. And from the birth of that, Westerners were able to practice it, initially primarily in India. And now, the sending of Goenka into India to start the Vipassana movement was again a direct result of the British conquest of Burma, and it led to the retreats that brought so many folks to the Dharma in the West. So, in every one of the modern lineages, you can, I think it's helpful, and I think it's necessary, and it's a postmodern practice to not take the lineage both as disconnected from historical context. So, so you could take, a tradition like, and someone's been mentioning this, this tradition, asking questions about it, like the Kriya Yoga tradition that gets popularized by Yogananda, and in his book, initially in his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and you could take a tradition like that and trace it back to how were his teachers responding to the conditions on the ground, and interacting with the British, interacting with America. Yogananda comes on tour in America and like gets super taken up by Hollywood, and builds an enormous ashram down in Southern California, nice place, and establishes the Self-Realization Fellowship. And again, what we want to do is, in a sense, I think we are forced by the contemporary moment to hold a kind of double consciousness whenever we do these practices, where we understand that we are engaging with a body of spiritual discipline. It could be physical, mantra, meditation, whatever the practices are, and we're engaging with our direct teachers in it, but we're also participating in the colonial and post-colonial and now global kind of diasporic tradition that holds these disciplines. And it's important to know that, because part of what, of course, erupts as the modern relationship to it, which is like, I'm just doing a pure ancient yoga that's been transmitted purely from the ancient, primordial Shiva down through the mystical sages down to the modern day. That's a modernist myth, right? A postmodern understanding says, yes, that, and politics and economics and gender and culture and local conditions and global conditions and resource extraction, and Christianity and brings us to like, oh, this is actually complex. And so, somewhere in the mid-aughts, there's this whole explosion of critique in Western yoga around cultural appropriation, right? What does it mean for white folks or folks from colonial backgrounds to be practicing a spiritual discipline developed by folks that the white folks' ancestors colonized? And so if you're in a position of colonial power, not so much like what you should or shouldn't do, I think that's too reductive, but what does it mean to be in relationship to the spiritual disciplines of a colonized people, or a genocided people, or an almost fully destroyed people, culturally? This comes into play very much when white folks take up indigenous knowledge systems. If when I go and witness the dances of my local indigenous folks here, the Pomo and the Miwok, it's a postmodern wisdom to know that everything about how they're doing it and how I am witnessing it is conditioned by what's now more consciously being called the California genocide, where the California tribes were almost entirely wiped out, primarily by the Spanish, when California was Mexico. And that my presence here is of course interwoven with that history, right? And we want to resist any overly simplistic reaction to this, like that I should, like do any particular thing in relation to it. I think what I should do is be profoundly respectful, first of all. So I'll go that far. But like, do we then say, like, should I not go, for instance, to witness the Pomo dances? Is that the right thing to do? Is paying reparations the right thing to do? If you live in the Bay Area, you have the opportunity to give what's called shumi land tax to Segorate, which is an organization of indigenous folks in the East Bay who are rematriating land and developing a land base for the Ohlone there. And so I strongly encourage you to do that if you live in that area, or to figure out how to be in a reparative relationship with the indigenous people of the land that you're now living on. How do we think about something like that in relation to a tradition like yoga, right? Which partly was taught by Indian teachers to white students, volitionally. No one forced, those teachers to teach. At the same time, economic conditions, in some cases, you might say, did force those traditions to teach. What does it mean for those traditions to be taught to Westerners? And how do you tease out, essentially, power in those relationships, right? Part of what's important here is that there's not a one-size-fits-all principle. Yoga, to the extent that it's part of modern Hinduism, and it sort of is and sort of isn't, but let's say mostly it is. Hinduism is not a religion that encourages conversion. Hinduism doesn't try to ask you to become Hindu if you like its practices. Hinduism is relatively close, depending on what kind of Hinduism, and there's lots in the Indian subcontinent, it's relatively close to its indigenous roots, which is to say its deities, in many cases, are ecosystem deities. There are still deities of the river, the mountain, the elements that are around you in that place, right? So if you're a devotee of Shiva, Shiva can be an abstract deity that governs the entire universe and all space and time in an infinite non-dual sort of way. But he also lives on Mount Kailash, up near the source of the Ganga. And when his wife Parvati was killed, he flew grieving all around India, and parts of her body dropped in different places. And there are holy spots, on the land. Here's the place where her eye dropped, and it's a deep, deep lake, like pure, deep blue lake, right? That's an indigenous knowledge, right? That lake is the eye of the goddess. And so then that has to be abstracted into myth to translate to, let's say, Northern California. I'm quite far away from Parvati's eye. That's okay, right? Because Shiva is cosmic and infinite. But that's a very different translation than, for instance, Buddhism, where the Buddha said, this is a practice of liberating the heart from suffering by seeing clearly. It's not local. It doesn't have local deities. It travels, and you have to convert into it. Buddhism is an evangelical tradition, where Hinduism is not. So Buddhism says anybody can do this, and you can come from any tradition, and you can practice the Eightfold Path and become liberated. And he encouraged his monks to spread out and go far and spread the Dharma in local languages wherever they went, right? That's a very different gesture culturally than what the Hindu tradition did. And so the colonial dynamics then of practicing yoga are very different than the dynamics of practicing the Buddha Dharma. And the dynamics of what we could call cultural appropriation, like inappropriate contact with an othered culture, particularly when you're in a position of power, that would be like tattooing a deity on your foot, really not understanding that in Hindu culture that would be extremely offensive in many places, right? Or inappropriately using mantra, inappropriately using images of deities. And so, this bubbled very hotly in Western yoga because, the deep delusion of the colonial mind has taken a long time to uproot. And it has been happening, right? It's far more cultural awareness now than there was 20 years ago in Dharma communities, in yoga communities. And so, I feel um, I'm grateful that this has happened. A lot of it, some of it was painful, particularly in the ways that scandal and criminality were some of the results of the late colonial period and the transmission of these systems. My first Buddhist teacher was an old Zen monk who was born in 1906 in feudal Japan under the emperor, and who had been a monk since he was 10 years old and grew up, in a tiny rural monastery, building wood fires under pots of rice at 2 a.m. as a novice monk. And by the late 50s, we learned he has been sent to Los Angeles to found a temple. He founds a lineage of American Zen, and we don't find out until many decades later that basically he had embezzled money and abused women and caused so much chaos in his home temple that they kind of like sent him to America to get rid of him. He becomes a great guru here and abuses his female students consistently for about 50 years. We ask him to stop over and over and over and over and over, and he doesn't. Many of us, including myself, get disgusted and leave after however long. I left in 99, and without losing any aspect of being deeply critical of what he did, I can also understand that this is a man who came from a radically different world than the one he ended up in. And that's the translation that the colonial and post-colonial and the globalized period brought to us. And it was just so chaotic, And there's no excuse, either spiritual or sociopolitical and historical, for his actions, but his actions were predictable karma of the modern period. And unfortunately, it's a story that's so common. It's common, I think, because the defining feature of the postmodern is chaos, is disorganization, and to quote a modernist poet, turning and turning in a widening gyre, right? The center cannot hold, said Yeats, quite a long time ago now. But understanding that, I'll just keep going with him, but that there was a rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem to be born, that there was something in the moment that has unfolded over the last 150 years that that has been profoundly destructive to cultures everywhere, and that the movement of power in our lifetimes has harmed so much, and that even the beautiful traditions that have been transmitted globally have been affected by the fierce violence of the colonial period, and that we're still crawling our way out of that, if we are. I didn't mean to end on that note, but there you go. There's something like a fascist coup unfolding in the United States, and this is itself a very, very postmodern moment, and karmic unfolding of the reshuffling of the globe that happened as a result of the colonial period. Even the argument right now, I'm not going to go there, but like even the fact that an American president could now say, you know, the border between the United States and Canada is essentially artificial, and I'm going to walk over it. The border between the United States and Canada, of course, is a completely artificial colonial line that was drawn across the prairies for a particular political reason, and in the middle of, you know, a genocidal expansion. So he's not wrong that it's fictional, in the same way that, you know, the Kurds are not wrong that the borders of Iraq and Syria are fictional. And you know, because and on through all the modern borders that were a consequence of, you know, a consequence of the colonial period and the crumbling of locality. And so we're still unraveling from the violence of that, you know, of modernity. And we can feel it in every tradition that we practice, in the Dharma, in yoga, and throughout our communities. So, all right, pausing there. May everybody be safe in this wild moment. Hi, thanks for joining us for this talk and practice. If these recordings are helpful for you, please consider supporting the Sangha with a donation of any amount. You can find links to our website and the donation page below in the description. Liking and subscribing helps the channel, and I'm grateful for your presence, your practice, and anything you can give to support our little community. Thank you so much. Take care.